The cold wind screamed across the muddy wagon road below the Whitehorn Range, carrying the scent of pine resin and approaching snow. March in Montana Territory. 1886 meant ice still clung to the northern slopes while mud claimed the valleys below. Ahanu Two Feathers stood beside the freight office's weathered planks, his breath misting in the thin air, watching a woman step down from the rear of a supply wagon with all the dignity of someone who had been bouncing on hard boards for 3 days straight. She wore a torn cotton calico dress, once blue, now dulled to the color of creek stones, washed smooth by winter runoff. Her bonnet hung crooked, revealing dark brown hair pinned hastily. One gloved hand gripped an old leather valise, cracked at the corners and held together by faith and a leather strap. The other clutched a letter, the paper soft from repeated folding and unfolding, the kind of nervous handling that spoke of desperation rather than anticipation. The freight clerk, a narrow-shouldered man named Willis, with ink stains permanently embedded in his cuffs, squinted at her paperwork through spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. "Says here you're bound for Lonesome Point, ma'am. This here's Lone Pine, different town entirely." The woman's face went pale beneath the dust, her eyes widening with the particular horror of someone who had just realized their last safety net had been cut. "Wrong town." "Wrong town? Wrong groom, I reckon." Willis scratched his jaw, the rasp of stubble audible in the quiet. "Nearest stage north won't run till Wednesday, account of the roads being washed out from the thaw." Ahanu turned his gaze toward the horizon, reading the sky the way his Lakota grandmother had taught him before she died. Thunderheads gathered above the ridge, purple, black, and low, pressing down like a bruise. The air tasted like iron and ozone. 3 minutes, maybe 5, before the sky opened and turned the road into a river of mud that would trap anything on wheels until it dried. Behind him, the woman's voice rose tight with the kind of control that came from practice at hiding panic. "I have no funds for lodging. The agency assured me the arrangement was confirmed." Willis shrugged, already turning back toward his office. "Ain't my trouble, ma'am. Agency makes mistakes same as anybody." A rider splashed past on a bay horse mud, flying from its hooves, and the man's eyes lingered on the woman with the kind of predatory assessment that made Ahanu's jaw tighten. The rider's coat bore the dust of long travel, his gun belt worn low and professional. His gaze slid to Ahanu, dismissed him as irrelevant, and then he spurred toward the saloon at the end of the street, where lamplight already glowed against the gathering dark. From the pastures beyond town, a rifle shot cracked the air, some rancher scaring off coyotes or putting down an injured steer. The woman flinched hard, her hand flying to her throat, and Ahanu saw the tremor in her fingers before she forced them still. The first raindrop hit the dirt near Ahanu's boot with a sound like a small stone. Then another, cold and hard as pebbles, carrying the promise of a deluge. Willis turned toward the freight office door, his keys jangling. "Ahanu Two Feathers got a shipment for you. 3 crates of school slates from the Territorial Education Office. Sign here." The woman froze. Her head snapped toward Ahanu with a speed that spoke of recognition, and for a heartbeat, her expression flickered through fear, confusion, recognition. Something complex and terrified that made no sense for a stranger just off a wagon who should not know his name from anyone but the clerk's casual mention. She took a half-step back, her valise swinging against her leg, and her eyes dark brown wide, and suddenly, very afraid, met his. Ahanu met her gaze steadily, keeping his face neutral, the way he had learned to do in the 15 years since his brother died at the end of a rope. He could walk away. He had done it for 15 years, built his entire life around the principle of no entanglements, no debts, no favors that could be twisted into accusations later. He had learned that lesson with blood and hemp rope and a brother's body that took 3 days to be allowed burial. The memory rose unbidden his brother's face, 19 years old, and already lined with the kind of weariness that came from being half Lakota in a territory that preferred its Indians on reservations or dead. The girl's testimony delivered in tears that the jury found convincing, claiming threats that never happened. No witnesses but her word. No evidence but her virtue and his brother's skin. The noose had been new rope, still stiff, and it had taken longer than it should have. Ahanu had been 20, old enough to understand what it meant, old enough to build walls. But the storm was coming, and the nearest boarding house would not open its door to a woman alone without a deposit she clearly did not have. And there was something in her fear that was not simple or straightforward. The wind howled, rising to a pitch that promised violence. Coyotes answered from the grasslands beyond town, their voices thin and hungry. Ahanu signed the freight sheet without looking at it, his hand moving by habit, the scratch of the pen loud in the sudden quiet before the storm. The woman stood motionless, rain beginning to darken her shoulders, and turned the blue fabric navy, her knuckles white around the handle of her valise. 3 minutes, he said quietly, nodding toward the sky. His voice was rougher than he intended, scraped raw by years of careful silence. Maybe less before it breaks proper. She did not move. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face, searching for something he did not understand. He picked up the first crate of slates, hoisted it onto his shoulder with the easy strength of someone who had spent his life doing physical work, and walked toward his horse. Behind him, he heard her breath hitch, heard the squelch of her boots in the mud as she made her choice between standing in the coming storm or following a man whose name terrified her. When he turned, she was following one step behind, her face set, like she was walking toward a gallows, but had decided it was better than drowning in the road. The storm broke with a crack of thunder that shook the ground. Rain came down in sheets, cold and vicious, turning the street into a river within seconds. Ahanu led the woman through the downpour to the shelter of the freight office's overhang water, streaming from his hat brim, then gestured toward the livery stable across the street. She nodded, once sharp and decisive, then ran skirts clutched high to keep them from tangling boots, splashing through water already ankle-deep. Inside the stable, the rain hammered the roof like distant gunfire, a sound that never stopped making Ahanu tense. The smell of hay and leather and horse sweat filled the dim space, familiar and grounding. He tied his roan horse, a 15-year-old gelding with a graying muzzle and the steady temperament of an animal that had seen everything, and set the crate down carefully. The woman stood near the door, dripping, her valise still clutched in one hand like a talisman. "You can set that down," Ahanu said, keeping his voice neutral and his distance deliberate. "It's safe enough here." She placed it carefully on a hay bale, then wrapped her arms around herself. Her teeth chattered, the sound audible in the pause between thunder rolls. He pulled a wool blanket from his saddlebag, the weave tight and warm from being pressed against the horse, and held it out without stepping closer. She hesitated for 3 heartbeats, her eyes flicking between his face and the blanket like she was calculating risk, then took it and wrapped it around her shoulders with movements that were almost prim in their precision. "Thank you." Her voice was steadier than he expected, given the shivering. He nodded and moved to check his horse's legs for stones, giving her space and time to decide what came next. The silence stretched, filled with rain and distant thunder and the soft sounds of the horse breathing. "My name is Sarah Bell," she said finally, her voice carrying that peculiar quality of someone forcing themselves to speak before courage failed. I was supposed to meet a banker in Lonesome Point. Mr. Samuel Crawford. There was an advertisement in the Omaha paper. I answered it. The agency made a mistake with the routing." Ahanu did not look up from his horse's hoof, picking out a piece of gravel with careful movements. "Mistakes happen, especially with the railroad routes changing. I'm a telegraph operator." Was. She paused, and he heard her swallow. "I worked for the Union Pacific in Omaha. I lost my position when the railroad consolidated offices last year. 3 operators became 1. I sold everything to afford the travel fare and the agency fee. He straightened, meeting her eyes. She held his gaze this time, though her hands twisted in the blanket with enough force to whiten her knuckles. "This town has a doctor," Ahanu said carefully. "A school teacher. A boarding house if you have coin for a few nights until the stage runs. I have 70 cents. Her chin lifted slightly. Total. The rain eased slightly, shifting from deluge to steady drumming that would last hours. Ahanu considered the problem with the same methodical care he applied to everything. 70 cents would buy her 2 nights if the boarding house matron felt charitable, which Mrs. Pemberton sometimes did and sometimes did not, depending on her mood and the state of the guest. After that, unless the stage ran early or someone wired funds, Sarah Bell would be stranded in a town that had little use for unemployed telegraph operators and less patience for women alone without visible means of support. Not his trouble, not his responsibility. He had learned that lesson thoroughly. He moved toward the stable door, reaching for the latch. Doctor's office is 2 buildings north, the one with the painted sign. He's a fair man. Might know someone needing help with laundry or cooking. Wait. Her voice stopped him sharp with something more than cold or fear. You're Ahanu Two Feathers. He turned slowly, his hand still on the door latch. I am. I heard your name 3 years ago. She swallowed hard enough that he saw her throat work. In a telegraph message. I was working the night shift on the railroad lines. The message was encoded railroad cipher, the kind they use for sensitive freight information. But I worked those lines long enough to decode most traffic without thinking about it. There was a message about a man named Henry Calhoun, railroad clerk out of Cheyenne. The message said he was shot in his office. The message mentioned your name. Ahanu went very still. The stable felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer and the single exit behind him seeming very far away. Why would that concern you? Because I ran. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the enclosed space. I decoded that message, and I was terrified. The message involved powerful people. I saw references to deputy to freight agents, to territorial officials, and I thought... She stopped, shook her head hard. I don't know what I thought. Only that people who decoded messages about murders sometimes ended up dead themselves, and I wanted no part of it. So I packed everything that night, gave notice in the morning, and left Omaha within a week. I've been moving since. Eventually, I had no choice but to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. It was that or. She did not finish, but she did not need to. The alternatives for a woman alone without funds in 1886 were limited and grim. Ahanu's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. 15 years of keeping his head down, his record, clean, his interactions distant and formal. 15 years of refusing to give anyone ammunition to use against him the way they had used a white girl's lies to hang his brother. And now a woman who knew his name from a message about a dead man who had run from that knowledge, who was now standing in front of him in a stable in the middle of nowhere because a routing clerk had made a mistake. I didn't kill anyone, he said flatly. He said, I never said you did. Then why tell me? Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger. Because when I heard your name from the clerk, I was afraid. I thought maybe I had been routed here deliberately, that somehow someone had tracked me down. But then I realized if you were part of whatever got Henry Calhoun killed, you wouldn't be standing in a freight yard signing for school slates. You'd be somewhere more important, or more hidden. A bull bellowed somewhere in the street, the sound enormous and angry. Shouts followed high and panicked. Ahanu moved to the stable door and saw a longhorned steer charging down the muddy street, head-low horns swinging wide enough to gut a horse. A ranch hand chased behind, waving a rope and cursing in Spanish, his boots slipping in the mud and losing ground with every step. Sarah stepped up beside him without being asked, her body tensing. The bull veered toward the stable, its eyes rolling white. Ahanu grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the nearest support post, pressing them both back as the animal crashed past, close enough that he felt the heat of its body and smelled the rank, fierce sweat. Its hooves threw mud in sheets, and its breath came in great steaming gouts. It barreled into a water trough 20 feet away, flipped it with a tremendous crash that sent water gazering, and kept running toward the grasslands beyond town, the ranch hand giving up the chase and standing bent over with his hands on his knees. Sarah's shoulder pressed against Ahanu's chest, her breath fast and shallow. He could feel her heart pounding through the layers of wet fabric. He released her immediately and stepped back, putting proper distance between them. "You all right?" She nodded, brushing mud from her skirt, with hands that were remarkably steady, given what had just happened. "I've seen worse in Omaha. Stampede at the stockyards in '84 killed 3 men. He believed her. There was something in the way she moved, economical, practical, unshakable, that spoke of someone who had learned to survive without the luxury of hysterics. The rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Weak sunlight breaking through the clouds and turning the street into a field of mirrors. Steam rose from the mud in ghostly ribbons. Ahanu checked the freight office and saw Willis locking up for the evening, pulling the shutters closed against the damp. "Come on," Ahanu said, making the decision even as he questioned it. "Where?" "Doctor's office. You're shivering and that dress won't dry before dark. He's got a stove and usually has the sense to keep it stoked." Sarah picked up her valise, and Ahanu saw her wince as she put weight on her right foot. "Blister?" "Probably. The shoes are new. Well, new to me. I bought them used in Omaha before I left." She followed him into the street without complaint. Dr. Whitcomb's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building that also served as his home. The upper floor divided into bedrooms for himself and his son. The sign above the door read, "Physician and Surgeon," in faded black letters that were peeling at the edges, evidence of a man too busy treating patients to maintain his own property. Ahanu knocked twice the signal they had established years ago to distinguish patients from trouble and pushed the door open. The doctor looked up from a table where he was grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, the sharp smell of sage and something more medicinal filling the warm room. He was 45 with graying hair that had once been black and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows and his hands were stained green from the herbs. "Ahanu," he said, then looked past him to Sarah, his eyebrows rising slightly. "And a guest. She got caught in the storm. Got caught. Needs somewhere dry." Ahanu kept his explanation brief, knowing the doctor would understand what was not being said. Doc Whitcomb nodded and gestured to a chair near the cast-iron stove. "Sit, ma'am. I'll stoke the fire proper." Sarah set her valise down carefully and moved to the chair, her movements precise despite the obvious exhaustion. Ahanu remained near the door, keeping his distance, maintaining the careful boundaries he had established over 15 years. "This is Sarah Bell," Ahanu said. "She's waiting on a stage north. Routing mistake with the mail-order bride agency." The doctor added wood to the stove, the dry pieces catching quickly and sending up a wave of heat that made the room feel smaller and more intimate. He filled a kettle from a pump in the corner and set it on the stove. "Stage won't run till Wednesday at the earliest. Roads are bad and the Sable River's running high from snowmelt. You have lodging, Miss Bell?" "Not yet." And it's Mrs. Sarah's voice was quiet. I'm a widow. Ahanu glanced at her, surprised. She had not mentioned a husband. Doc Whitcomb's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Mrs. Pemberton runs the boarding house on 3rd Street. She's particular about her guests, but fair if you meet her standards. I can send word you're coming if that would help. Thank you. That's kind. A small boy appeared at the top of the stairs, pale and thin, his nightshirt hanging on a frame that was all bones and fragile bird chest. He coughed a wet rattling sound that seemed too large for such a small body. Charlie, Doc Whitcomb said gently, his voice taking on the particular tone of a father, trying not to show fear. Back to bed, son. The boy nodded and disappeared without a word, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden steps. The doctor's face tightened with worry so profound it was almost physical pain. Lung fever? Ahanu said quietly, knowing the answer already. Yes, it's been 3 weeks now. I'm doing what I can, but he needs better medicine, the quinine sulfate from back east, not the local substitutes. The kind that costs more than I've got in hand. Doc Whitcomb's voice was flat with the exhaustion of a man, watching his child die by inches. I treat everyone who comes through that door regardless of their ability to pay, which means my own coffers are usually empty when I need them. Ahanu nodded slowly. He had brought the doctor meat from his hunts more than once, payment for treatments rendered to Lakota families who had nothing else to offer. It was a system that worked until it did not. The kettle began to steam, whistling softly. Doc Whitcomb poured water into 2 tin cups and handed them to Sarah and Ahanu. Sarah wrapped her hands around the cup, her fingers finally regaining some color, the blue tinge fading from her nail beds. If you need work, Mrs. Bell, the doctor said, shifting back to practicalities, Mrs. Eliza Hart at the schoolhouse might use help. She teaches reading and numbers to settler and Lakota children both. She's always short on hands and long on need. I'll ask her, Sarah said. Thank you for the suggestion, doctor. Ahanu set his cup down, and the metal ringing softly against the wooden table. I'll walk you to the boarding house. It's getting dark. They left the doctor's office as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the peaks gold and purple. The street was quieter now, lamps being lit in windows, the smell of cooking fires and frying meat drifting from houses. Ahanu walked on the side closest to the road, his hand never far from the knife on his belt, not because he expected trouble in this particular moment, but because 15 years had taught him to expect nothing else, and the habit had saved his life more than once. At the boarding house, a narrow 2-story structure with lace curtains and a painted sign that read, Mrs. Pemberton's Respectable Lodging. Mrs. Pemberton herself answered the door. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, her hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her face, her expression one of permanent suspicion toward the world and everyone in it. Mrs. Pemberton. Ahanu said, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Whitcomb sent word about a guest. She looked Sarah up and down, with the kind of thorough assessment usually reserved for livestock, at auction taking in the torn dress, the muddy boots, the exhaustion written in every line of her body. Then she glanced at Ahanu with an expression he could not quite read. 2 nights, Mrs. Pemberton said finally, her voice clipped. 70 cents total. Supper's at 6. You're late, so there's cold cornbread and beans if you want it. Room at the top of the stairs on the right. No guests after dark, no cooking in the rooms, no loud noises. Church on Sundays expected but not required. Breakfast at 7. Sarah handed over the coins with fingers that trembled slightly. Mrs. Pemberton pocketed them and stepped aside, holding the door just wide enough for Sarah to enter. Thank you, Sarah said quietly. The door closed with a firm click that was not quite a slam. Ahanu turned to leave his boots loud on the wooden boardwalk. "Mr. Two Feathers." He stopped and turned back. Sarah stood on the porch, silhouetted by the lamplight from inside her face, cast half in shadow. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You don't know me. I told you I know your name from a message about a murder." Most men would have walked away. He considered the question. The truthful answer was complicated and uncomfortable, and involved his brother's death and 15 years of guilt about not being able to save him, and the nagging sense that walking away from someone in need made him complicit in all the other times people had walked away. The simpler answer was that he genuinely did not know what impulse had made him sign for the slates and offer help. "Storm's over." He said instead the words inadequate and true. "Get some rest, Mrs. Bell." He walked into the dark, his boots echoing on the boardwalk, and did not look back, even though he felt her eyes following him until he turned the corner. Ahanu lived 3 miles outside town in a one-room cabin built from chinked logs and topped with a sod roof that leaked during heavy rains and grew wildflowers in summer. The cabin sat on Bureau of Indian Affairs land, assigned to him when he took the job as translator and scout 6 years ago, after he had spent 9 years drifting through the territory doing whatever work would have him and learning to keep his mouth shut. It was not much a single room with a bunk built into one wall, a cast-iron stove, a table, and 2 chairs his German uncle had built, and a shelf for his few possessions. But it was his, and no one could take it from him as long as he kept his job and his reputation clean. Inside, he lit a lantern and set it on the table, the warm light pushing back the darkness. His mother's German books lined the single shelf volumes she had taught him to read before she died of fever when he was 12. Her final gift, the language of her childhood and the stories of a country she would never see again. Goethe, Schiller, a Lutheran hymnal with her name written in fading ink on the first page. He had not opened them in years, but he kept them clean and dry, wiping the covers monthly with an oiled cloth. His brother's knife hung on a peg above the door, the blade wrapped in doeskin to protect the edge, forged by their Lakota uncle. 2 horses before he died, the blade bore etchings of a wolf and a thunderbird, the symbols of their family line. His brother had carried it from the time he was 14 until the day they hanged him for a crime he did not commit. Ahanu had been forbidden to claim the body for 3 days, forced to watch it hang as a warning. When they finally cut his brother down, the knife had been the only possession returned. Ahanu pulled off his wet shirt and hung it near the stove to dry his skin, prickling in the cool air, then poured cornmeal into a pot with water and a pinch of salt for mush. While it cooked, he thought about Sarah Bell and her fear when she heard his name about the message she had decoded 3 years ago that connected him to a dead railroad clerk named Henry Calhoun. He did not remember anyone named Calhoun specifically. He had scouted for the railroad in 1880, mapping routes through the high country and identifying water sources and potential trouble spots with hostile bands. He had met dozens of clerks and engineers and surveyors, their faces blurring together into a mass of white men with ink-stained fingers and careful ledgers. If Calhoun had been among them, Ahanu had no memory of it. But someone had connected them. Someone had put his name in a message about murder. Ahanu ate his mush in silence, the spoon scraping against the tin bowl, staring at the lantern flame, and trying to remember details from 6 years ago that had seemed unimportant at the time. Outside, coyotes howled, their voices rising and falling in the particular harmony that meant they had made a kill. The wind picked up again, rattling the door in its frame and whistling through gaps in the chinking. He cleaned his bowl with sand, and a rag banked the fire in the stove and lay down on his bunk. Sleep came slowly, his mind turning over questions without answers. When he finally slept, he dreamed of his brother standing on the gallows, but when the hood was pulled off the condemned man's face, it was Ahanu's own face staring back at him. And below the platform, a woman with dark hair held up a piece of paper covered in signatures that kept shifting and changing names, appearing and disappearing like smoke. He woke before dawn, sweating despite the cold, and could not remember what the signatures had said. The next morning, Ahanu rode into town at first light to deliver the school slates to Mrs. Eliza Hart. The schoolhouse was a converted church building, drafty and cold, with a cracked bell in the steeple that rang off-key when pulled, and gaps between the floorboards wide enough to lose a pencil through. But Mrs. Hart had fought the Territorial Education Board for 3 years to get funding, and she ran the school with the kind of fierce determination that came from believing education was the only weapon that mattered in the long run. Mrs. Hart met him at the door, a sturdy woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair, pinned severely, and hands calloused from farm work before she became a teacher and from scrubbing floors after. She wore a simple brown dress with a white collar, practical and worn at the cuffs. "Morning, Ahanu," she said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who had grown up in Ohio and never quite lost the accent. Slates finally came. 3 crates. I'll bring them in. He unloaded the crates from his horse and stacked them inside the schoolhouse near the pot-bellied stove that provided inadequate heat. A dozen children sat on benches. Half were Lakota, their hair cut short in the way the Bureau required, dressed in a mixture of traditional and white clothing. Half were settler children in various states of cleanliness and shoe-having. Mrs. Hart treated them all exactly the same, which made her rare enough to be remarkable and controversial enough to be frequently threatened by parents on both sides who thought mixing the children was dangerous or foolish or against natural law. "Heard you helped a woman yesterday." Mrs. Hart said, her tone carefully neutral, as she often was when discussing things that might be gossip or might be important. "Woman off the freight wagon. She got caught in the storm. Needed dry shelter. Deputy Pike's been asking about her." Ahanu's jaw tightened, his hands stilling on the crate he was opening. Deputy Ezra Pike was 40 years old, arrogant in the way of men given a badge and a gun, and told they represented law in a place where law was mostly a suggestion, and quick to use his position as a weapon against anyone who annoyed him or failed to show proper deference. He had a reputation for harassment, for fabricating charges when it suited his purposes, and for making life difficult for anyone who crossed him. Why would Pike care about a mail-order bride who got routed to the wrong town? Didn't say. Just wanted to know who she was, why she was here, and where she was staying. Mrs. Hart paused, her eyes meeting his with the particular look she got when she was worried. "Ahanu, be careful. Pike's been looking for an excuse to come after you since you turned down his offer last year." Ahanu remembered. Pike had approached him outside the freight office, smiling his politician's smile, and offered good money for Ahanu to scout what he called private ventures routes for moving whiskey to the reservation's paths that avoided bureau patrols. Ahanu had refused with 2 words, "Not interested," and walked away. Pike's smile had vanished and his voice had dropped to something colder. "You'll regret that too, Feathers. Half-breeds who think they're too good for honest work usually find themselves facing charges." Ahanu had not responded, had simply kept walking, but he had known then that Pike would remember the insult. "I'm always careful," Ahanu said now, finishing with the crates and standing. "I know. But this feels different. Pike rode out to Red Bluff yesterday afternoon, took Clancy Greaves with him. They came back after dark, and Pike was angry about something. Clancy Greaves was a former Pinkerton detective who had been fired for excessive violence, even by Pinkerton standards, which was saying something. He now worked as hired muscle for whoever could pay his rates, and Pike used him for jobs that required intimidation or worse. "I'll watch myself," Ahanu said. "Thank you for the warning." He left the schoolhouse and rode toward the freight office to check if any other shipments had arrived. The town was waking slowly, shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks, horses being hitched to wagons, and the smell of baking bread drifting from the bakery on 2nd Street, where Mrs. Chen worked 18 hours a day and produced the best sourdough within 50 miles. As he passed the boarding house, he saw Sarah step outside, dressed in the same calico dress, now clean and mended with small, neat stitches along the torn hem. Her hair was pinned properly, and she carried her valise in one hand and her reticule in the other. She saw him and nodded once, a small acknowledgement. He returned the nod and continued toward the freight office, aware that several people on the street had noticed the exchange and would be talking about it within the hour. Willis was unloading crates from a wagon when Ahanu arrived, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. "Morning, Two Feathers," Willis said without looking up. "Got another delivery for you. Bureau paperwork, looks like." Ahanu dismounted and signed for the bundle of envelopes, official correspondence that he would need to translate and deliver to the Lakota families living on allotted land around Lone Pine. As he signed, he noticed an envelope in the outgoing mail rack, addressed in precise handwriting to A. Two Feathers, C.O. Red Bluff Freight Office. "That for me?" Ahanu asked, pointing. Willis glanced at it, squinting. "No, that's outgoing. Going to Red Bluff on the afternoon freight. Different Two Feathers, I reckon. Or maybe someone sending to your people out there." Ahanu frowned. There were no other Two Feathers in the territory that he knew of. His family was small, his mother's German relatives had mostly returned east or died, and his father's Lakota family was scattered across 3 reservations. His uncle Fritz Kruger lived in Red Bluff and worked as a freight agent, but he used his German name exclusively and had for 30 years. Before he could ask more questions, gunfire cracked from the other end of the street, loud and sudden. Ahanu spun his hand, going to his knife. Willis dropped behind a crate with a curse. 2 men on horseback fired revolvers into the air, the muzzle flashes bright in the morning shadow, their laughter carrying over the echoing shots. One was the rider from yesterday, the one who had stared at Sarah with predatory interest. The other was Clancy Greaves, recognizable by his scarred face and the particular way he sat a horse weight forward, like he was always ready to attack. They wheeled their horses in a tight circle and fired again, this time deliberately, at the freight office. Bullets punched through the wooden walls with sounds like hammers hitting boards, splinters flying. One bullet hit a crate of nails and sent them spraying across the floor like shrapnel. Ahanu grabbed Willis and dragged him behind the loading platform, pressing them both flat. Willis gasped, clutching his side, and Ahanu saw blood seeping between his fingers, spreading dark across his shirt. "Blast!" Willis hissed through clenched teeth. "Why would they?" The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had started. Hooves clattered away toward the saloon at the far end of town, the riders whooping like it was a celebration. Ahanu tore open Willis's shirt, his hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had treated gunshot wounds before. The wound was a graze along the ribs, deep enough to bleed heavily, but not deep enough to have penetrated the lung. He pressed his bandana against it. "Hold this. Press hard. Don't move." Willis nodded, his face gray with pain and shock. People began emerging from buildings, shouting questions, their voices high with panic. Doc Whitcomb ran toward them from his office, 2 buildings away, his medical bag in hand, his coat half-buttoned. Ahanu turned toward the freight office door, which hung half-open, swinging on its hinges. Inside papers were scattered across the floor. Crates overturned, the careful organization of the morning destroyed. The smell of gun smoke hung thick. He stepped inside carefully, his boots crunching on broken glass from the window. The outgoing mail rack was empty, letters scattered across the floor. The envelope addressed to A. Two Feathers was gone. And then he saw her. Sarah Bell stood behind the counter, pressed against the wall, pale and shaking, holding an envelope in both hands. Her eyes were wide, her breathing fast. They were going to burn it. she said, her voice trembling but clear. I was walking past, heard them shooting. I looked through the window and saw them inside. They grabbed the mail, threw most of it in the stove. I came in through the back door while they were distracted. I took this one before they could burn it. Ahanu moved toward her, slowly keeping his movements calm and non-threatening. Give it to me. She handed it over, and he felt the faint tremor in her fingers as the paper passed between them. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from a ledger, the edges ragged. The entries were written in neat columns, and the handwriting precise and mechanical, dates running from January through April 1883. Locations listed as mining camps, in the territories quantities listed as implements, but with numbers that made no sense for farming equipment. 50 per shipment. Recipient names abbreviated EPNHTR. At the bottom of the page, in different ink and a different hand, someone had written, Calhoun Ledger Fragment Proof of Diversion Original, held by H.C. Deceased, June 1883. Henry Calhoun. Ahanu's blood went cold, his heart rate spiking despite his efforts to stay calm. He knew what this was. EP was almost certainly Ezra Pike. NH would be Nathan Hale, the reservation trader, known throughout the territory for corruption and for selling goods that were supposed to be free under treaty agreements. TR. He did not recognize immediately. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. That's the name. From the telegraph message I decoded, the man who was shot. Henry Calhoun. Ahanu looked up, meeting her eyes. You saw this exact paper before? No. But I decoded enough of the message to know it mentioned stolen rifles, a ledger with shipping records and names of people involved. When I saw this envelope being thrown in the stove, I recognized the handwriting on the address. It's the same style as the shipping manifests. I used to log when I worked the telegraph office in Omaha. Very precise, almost mechanical. Railroad clerks are trained to write that way, so their reports are legible no matter who reads them. Ahanu folded the paper and slipped it into his coat, his mind already working through implications. We need to leave. Now. What? But we should take this too. Pike is the deputy. He's the law in this town. We take this to him, we're dead. He kept his voice low and urgent. You took this paper from men who were willing to shoot up a freight office in broad daylight to destroy it. They saw you through the window, or they will when they come back to check their work. Her face went even paler, but she did not argue. Where do we go? Someplace safe, while we figure out what to do with this. Doc Whitcomb appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene quickly. Ahanu Willis will be fine. The bullet just creased him. What happened here? Pike's men shot up the office trying to destroy mail. We need to get Mrs. Bell somewhere safe. The doctor's face darkened with understanding. My office. Come on. They moved quickly through the street, drawing stares from the townspeople who were gathering to gossip about the shooting. Ahanu kept Sarah on his left side, putting his body between her and the direction Greaves and his companion had ridden. His hand never left the knife at his belt. At the doctor's office, Whitcomb locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains. Show me, he said simply. Ahanu handed him the ledger fragment. The doctor read it quickly, his expression growing grimmer with each line. If this is real, it's real, Sarah said quietly. I know railroad ledgers. That's genuine. Then you're both in danger. Pike's not just corrupt, he's connected. He's got friends in the territorial government, friends in the railroad company. You take this to the wrong person, and you'll disappear. We need to get it to someone who has authority over Pike, Ahanu said. Someone from outside the territory. Railroad investigator in Cheyenne, Doc Whitcomb said. Federal marshal if you can find one. But that's 3 days' ride minimum, and Pike will be looking for you within the hour. Sarah made a small sound, and Ahanu turned to see her sitting down hard in the chair by the stove, her face gray. Blood stained her skirt. "You're hurt," Ahanu said, moving toward her. "It's nothing. Just a graze. I felt something hit my leg when I was behind the counter, but there was too much happening to—" Her voice trailed off as she lifted her skirt enough to reveal a tear in the fabric and a bleeding wound on her outer thigh. Doc Whitcomb knelt immediately, his professional calm taking over. "Let me see." Ahanu, turn around. Ahanu turned his back, staring at the wall, his jaw clenched. Behind him, he heard the doctor's low murmur of instructions, heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, heard the sound of scissors cutting fabric, and then water being poured. "It's not deep," Whitcomb said after a long moment. "Bullet fragment, probably a splinter from one of the rounds that hit the building. But it needs stitches to close properly. This is going to hurt, ma'am." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice steady. "Do what you need to do." Ahanu heard the doctor threading a needle, heard Sarah's breathing change as the first stitch went in. But she did not cry out. After the third stitch, the doctor said, "You can turn around now. I'm just bandaging." Ahanu turned. Sarah's face was pale and dotted with sweat, her hands gripping the arms of the chair with enough force to whiten her knuckles, but her expression was composed. Doc Whitcomb wrapped her leg in clean linen, his movements practiced and gentle. "You'll need to keep weight off this for a day or two if you want it to heal properly without tearing the stitches." "I don't have a day or two," Sarah said quietly. "No." Ahanu agreed, his voice flat with the weight of understanding. "You don't." Whitcomb moved to a cabinet and pulled out a small derringer, the nickel plating worn dull from age. "Keep this. It's only got 2 shots, but it's better than nothing. I took it off a gambler who couldn't pay his bill last year." Sarah took the gun carefully, her hands steadier now, and checked the cylinder with the practiced movements of someone who knew firearms. "Thank you, doctor. Don't thank me. Just stay alive." He looked at Ahanu. "Where will you go?" Ahanu looked at the ledger fragment, studying the locations listed. "Eagle Pass Mine. It's listed here as a delivery point for the implements. If we can find more evidence there, more ledgers, witnesses, maybe even the stolen rifles themselves, we can take everything to Cheyenne and make a case that can't be ignored. That's a hard ride. 2 days at least, and you'll have to cross the Sable River. It's running high from snowmelt." "I know. And Pike will figure out where you're going. Those mining camps are the only places listed on that paper." "I know that too." Doc Whitcomb was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll tell anyone who asks that you were here that I treated Mrs. Bell for shock and that you both left heading east toward the territorial road. That might buy you a few hours before Pike figures out its misdirection." "Thank you." Outside, thunder rumbled again. The storm was returning the respite brief. Rain began to patter against the windows. Ahanu met Sarah's eyes. "You don't have to come with me. I can take the ledger and ride alone. You can stay here with Doc Whitcomb, maybe hide at the schoolhouse with Mrs. Hart. Pike doesn't know for certain that you took the paper." Sarah shook her head slowly. "He saw me in the freight office, or his men did. And even if they didn't, Willis saw me there and Pike will question him. If you leave me here, Pike will use me to get to you, threaten me until you come back or worse. And She paused, swallowing. "I've been running for 3 years from a telegraph message I decoded. I'm tired of running without knowing what I'm running from. If this ledger is connected to what got Henry Calhoun killed, then I want to see it through. I want to know the truth." Ahanu studied her face, seeing the fear there, but also the resolve. She was right about Pike leaving her behind would make her a target and a tool. And there was something else, something he did not have words for yet, about the way she had stepped into the freight office under gunfire to save a piece of paper because she thought it was important. That took a particular kind of courage. "Then we ride tonight," he said. "Soon as it's full dark, get some rest now if you can. It's going to be hard travel, and we won't be stopping much once we start." "I can handle hard travel." He believed her. Doc Whitcomb packed supplies, bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid for infections, strips of clean cloth, a packet of willow bark for pain. Sarah changed into a pair of the doctor's spare trousers, rolling the legs and cinching the waist with a strip of leather and a wool shirt that was too large but warmer than her dress. Over it all, she wore Ahanu's spare coat, the arms hanging past her hands until she rolled them. They left Lone Pine as night fell, and the rain began in earnest, slipping out the back of Doc Whitcomb's office and circling wide through the grasslands to avoid the main street. Ahanu's roan horse carried them both, Sarah behind him, with her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, her body pressed against his back. The wind howled, driving rain into their faces until breathing felt like drowning. Ahanu guided the horse away from the road, taking a deer path he knew from hunting a narrow track that climbed into the foothills through stands of pine and aspen. The trail was treacherous in the dark, and the wet mud slick and stones hidden beneath running water. Behind him, Sarah's grip tightened when the horse stumbled. He felt her breath against his neck when the wind gusted, felt the faint tremor of cold or fear or both. "How far to the river?" she called over the wind. 10 miles. Another 15 to the mine after we cross." "In this weather?" "In this weather." They rode in silence after that, both of them conserving energy and warmth. Ahanu focused on the trail, on reading the terrain through the rain and darkness using landmarks he had memorized over years of travel. An oddly shaped boulder, a lightning-split pine, a creek crossing where the water always ran clear. At his cabin, they stopped long enough to gather more supplies, dried venison hardtack, a tin pot, a second blanket, ammunition for his rifle. The cabin was cold and dark, and Ahanu did not light the lantern for fear of drawing attention. They worked by feel, their hands occasionally brushing in the darkness as they packed. When Sarah emerged from behind the blanket, he had hung as a divider, dressed in his spare clothes. Ahanu handed her a leather belt with a sheath for the derringer. She buckled it on, without comment, adjusting the fit. Their eyes met in the dimness, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then Ahanu turned and shouldered his pack. They rode back into the storm, heading north toward the Sable River and whatever waited beyond. The Sable River had swollen to twice its normal width, the water dark and fast and churning with debris, tree branches, deadfall, what might have been part of a fence. The usual ford was completely underwater, the stones that marked the safe crossing invisible beneath the current. Ahanu dismounted at the bank and studied the river, reading the flow and trying to judge depth. The roar of the water made talking difficult. Sarah slid down beside him, favoring her injured leg, but not complaining. "We have to cross here," she shouted over the noise. "Only safe crossing for 20 miles in either direction. The others are steeper banks or deeper water." "It doesn't look safe." "It's not, but it's less dangerous than the alternatives." He pulled a coiled lariat from his saddlebag, 50 feet of good braided rope that he had used for everything from roping cattle to hauling equipment. He tied one end to a willow tree growing at an angle over the bank, its roots exposed and its trunk bent from years of floods, then looped the other end around his waist. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, moving closer. "Testing the depth. If I can find solid footing at the midpoint, we can guide the horse across with the rope as a safety line. And if you can't find footing, then we ride 20 miles upstream and lose half a day while Pike closes the distance." He waded into the river before she could argue. The water was ice-cold, colder than the rain, numbing his legs within seconds despite his boots. The current pushed hard, trying to sweep his feet out from under him with steady, malicious pressure. He braced against it, moving slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. At the midpoint, the water reached his chest, pressing against him like a physical weight. He felt for the bottom with his boots and found solid stone, slick with moss, but stable. He turned and shouted back to Sarah, barely audible over the roar. "Hold the rope, keep tension." She grabbed the line where it extended from the willow and wrapped it around her hands, her boots planted wide for leverage, her face set with concentration. Ahanu led the horse into the water. The roan balked immediately, eyes rolling, white ears back. Ahanu pulled steadily on the reins, his voice low and calm. "Come on, old friend, I know, but we have to go." The horse stepped in, then slipped on the slick stones, thrashing in panic. Ahanu went under as the rope jerked hard, cold water closing over his head, filling his nose and mouth. He fought to the surface, gasping, still holding the reins. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. Behind him on the bank, Sarah braced the rope against the tree trunk, leaning back with all her weight to keep tension. "Come on," she hissed through gritted teeth, her voice lost in the water sound, but her meaning clear. "Come on, pull." Ahanu pulled hand over hand on the reins, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the river bottom. The horse found its footing and lunged forward, surging through the water with the kind of panicked strength that could break bones if you got in the way. Ahanu dove aside and let it go, watching as it scrambled up the far bank, reins trailing. He hauled himself across, using the rope, his arms shaking with exhaustion, until he collapsed on the far side, water streaming from his clothes. The horse stood 20 feet away, sides heaving but alive and whole. Sarah crossed next, using the rope hand over hand, the current pulling her downstream until she hung at an angle, her legs swept out behind her. Halfway across, her grip slipped. She went under with a gasp that was cut off by water. Ahanu lunged back into the river, grabbing her arm, his other hand locked on the rope. He hauled her toward him inch by brutal inch until he could get both arms around her and drag her to the bank. They collapsed together in the mud, both coughing, both shaking from cold and effort. For a moment they lay there side by side, breathing hard. Then Ahanu pushed himself up and pulled Sarah to her feet. "We have to keep moving. If we stop, we'll freeze." She nodded, teeth chattering too hard for speech. He stripped off his wet coat and pulled the spare blanket from his pack, wrapping it around her shoulders. Then he slapped her arms and back, with firm, open-handed blows, forcing circulation and warmth back into her body. It was rough, practical, graceless, and absolutely necessary. She gasped at the shock of it, but leaned into the treatment, understanding what he was doing. "Keep moving," he said. "Walk. Don't sit down." They wrung out what they could of their clothes, water running in streams from fabric that would not dry properly, until they found shelter and fire. Then they mounted the horse again, both of them dripping, and Ahanu urged it up the ridge toward higher ground and the thin cover of pine forest. Behind them, on the far bank, 2 riders appeared through the rain. Even at this distance, Ahanu recognized the shapes: Deputy Ezra Pike on his big chestnut gelding, and Clancy Greaves on a gray horse with white stockings. "They're following," Sarah said quietly, her voice tight. "I know. They must have gone to my cabin, found it empty, tracked us from there." "How far behind?" "Far enough that the river will slow them, but not far enough." Ahanu kicked the horse into a faster pace, heading toward the shale slopes that led to Eagle Pass and whatever evidence waited there. The terrain turned brutal as they climbed loose rock that shifted underfoot, steep inclines, where the horse had to scramble and lunge narrow ledges with drops into canyons filled with darkness and the sound of falling water. Every step sent stones skittering into the void below, with sounds like distant gunshots. They had been riding for an hour, the rain finally easing to a cold drizzle, when the first gunshot cracked across the slope. The bullet hit stone 20 feet to their left, sparking orange in the dim light, the ricochet whining away into the dark. Ahanu pulled the horse behind a boulder the size of a small cabin, the stone still warm from yesterday's sun. "Get down. Stay low." Sarah slid off the horse and pressed herself against the rock, the derringer appearing in her hand. Her face was pale but focused. Ahanu dismounted and pulled his rifle from its scabbard, checking the load by feel. 5 rounds. He had more ammunition in his saddlebag, but accessing it would mean exposing himself. Pike and Greaves were 300 yards back down the slope, barely visible in the failing light and the mist. They had dismounted and were using their horses as cover while they took aim. Greaves fired again. The bullet struck the boulder with a sound like a hammer on an anvil, showering them with rock dust and fragments. A sharp piece hit Ahanu's cheek, drawing blood. He sighted carefully, waiting for Greaves to show himself. When the hired gun shifted position, Ahanu fired once. The shot hit the ground near Greaves's horse, close enough that the animal spooked and reared hooves, flailing. Greaves grabbed for the reins, cursing, his attention divided. "We can't stay here." Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "They'll just wait us out or flank us." She was right. The boulder provided cover from direct fire, but if Pike and Greaves split up and came at them from 2 directions, they would be exposed. Ahanu scanned the terrain and spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face 30 feet away, barely visible in the shadows. It looked like it might cut through to the other side of the ridge. "There. That crack in the rock. Go." Sarah squeezed into the crevice, her body turning sideways to fit through the narrow opening, the stone scraping against her shoulders and back. Ahanu followed, pulling the horse as far as the opening before the space became too tight for the animal. He tied the reins to a scrub pine growing impossibly from bare rock and moved deeper into the crevice with Sarah. The crevice was dark and cold water dripping from overhead, the walls so close they had to turn sideways and shuffle. Ahanu led the way, his hands feeling along the stone, his breath loud in the enclosed space. Behind them, they heard voices, Pike and Greaves shouting to each other, their words echoing strangely off the rocks. Then footsteps, the scrape of boots on stone. A shadow passed across the entrance to the crevice, blocking the faint light. Ahanu pressed his hand over Sarah's mouth, gentle but firm, not intimacy but necessity. She went completely still, her eyes wide in the dimness. They heard Greaves's voice close enough to make out words. "They're in there somewhere. I can smell that damn horse." Pike's voice, hard and cold. "Burn them out. Set a fire at the entrance. Smoke will drive them deeper or kill them where they stand." Footsteps moved away. The sound of someone gathering brush, the strike of a match. Ahanu removed his hand from Sarah's mouth and pointed up. The crevice narrowed as it rose, but there was a faint line of slightly less dark that might mean an opening above. They climbed using hands and feet, wedging themselves between the walls, moving inch by inch toward the possibility of escape. The smell of smoke reached them acrid and choking. Below they heard the crackle of flames beginning to catch. They climbed faster, Sarah's breath coming in gasps, Ahanu's muscles burning with effort. His injured cheek throbbed where the rock fragment had hit. Above them, the line of lesser darkness grew wider. They emerged onto a ledge, high on the ridge, gasping in clean air, their clothes torn and their hands scraped raw. Below and behind them, smoke billowed from the crevice entrance. Ahanu circled back carefully, staying low, and approached from above. Pike and Greaves stood near the fire, watching the smoke and waiting. Their horses were tied nearby unguarded. Ahanu gestured to Sarah. They moved silently down the back side of the ridge, retrieved Ahanu's horse from where he had tied it, and rode hard for Eagle Pass, leaving Pike and Greaves to discover eventually that their prey had escaped. By the time they reached the mine bunkhouse, full night had fallen. The building was a long, low structure, built from rough timber with a single door and two narrow windows surrounded by tailings piles and rusted equipment that loomed like strange sculptures in the darkness. It sat at the base of a rocky hill, isolated the nearest other structure, the actual mine entrance, a quarter-mile up the slope. Ahanu dismounted and approached cautiously, his rifle ready. The door hung half-open, creaking in the wind. No light showed in the windows. No smoke rose from the chimney. Inside the bunkhouse was empty, no workers, no gear, no sign of recent habitation. Dust lay thick on the floor, disturbed only by animal tracks. But against the far wall, covered with canvas tarps that were newer than anything else in the building, stood wooden crates stacked 3 high. Sarah stepped past him and pulled back one tarp. The crates beneath were stamped with clear black stenciling, U.S. Army Springfield Armory rifles. She opened one crate with a pry bar hanging on the wall. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay Springfield rifles, the standard-issue weapon for military and Indian Wars use. 50 of them in this crate alone. 6 more crates visible. 300 rifles. Sarah said quietly, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Enough to arm a small war. Ahanu moved to a table near the bunks, where papers lay scattered. A ledger sat open, its pages filled with the same precise handwriting from the envelope. He scanned the entries, his stomach sinking with each line. Dates from 1882 through early 1883. Shipments listed as agricultural implements or mining equipment, routed through legitimate freight channels to Eagle Pass Mine, then distributed to Nathan Hale Reservation Trader, 50 rifles per quarter. Purpose listed as security for trading post. Deputy E. Pike Lone Pine, 30 rifles, no purpose listed. And then the entry that made his hands shake, approved for transport by F. Kruger, freight agent, Red Bluff. Signature on file. Fritz Kruger, his uncle, his mother's younger brother, the only family Ahanu had left who still spoke to him. Sarah touched his arm gently. You know him. Ahanu nodded slowly, his throat tight. He's my mother's brother, my Uncle Fritz. He raised me after my mother died, at least until I was old enough to work. I haven't seen him much in recent years, but I thought... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He had thought Fritz was honest, had thought at least one person in his family's legacy was clean. I'm sorry, Sarah said quietly. He closed the ledger with more force than necessary and slipped it into his coat with the fragment they already had. We have what we need. Let's go before Pike catches up. They'll come back here, Pike and Greaves. They'll know we found this. I know. But we'll be gone by then, and we'll have evidence they can't ignore. A sound outside, horses approaching at a walk, trying to be quiet. Ahanu extinguished his small lantern. They moved to the window and peered out through the grimy glass. Pike and Greaves were riding into the clearing along with 2 other men Ahanu did not recognize. 4 against 2. They were blocking the main path back down the ridge. Back door, Sarah whispered. There isn't one. Then we go under. She had spotted what Ahanu had missed in his focus on the ledgers, a loose floorboard near the corner, the kind of thing miners sometimes use to store valuables or whiskey away from supervisors. Ahanu knelt and pried it up with his knife. Beneath was a crawl space, maybe 2 feet high, dirt and stones and the smell of rot. Sarah lowered herself through the gap without hesitation, and Ahanu followed, pulling the board back into place above them. They lay flat in the dirt, shoulders touching in the cramped darkness, and waited. Boots thumped on the wooden floor above them, heavy and deliberate. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space under the floor. Pike's voice, muffled but clear, checked the crates. Make sure they didn't take anything. Greaves, crates are sealed, but someone's been here. Dust is disturbed. Another voice, unfamiliar. Tracks outside. 2 people and a horse heading in from the river trail. Pike. Then they're still close. Spread out. Check the mine entrance, the tailings, the equipment sheds. I want them found. The boots moved toward the door. Then Pike's voice again, closer to where they hid. Wait. Check under the floor. There's usually storage space in these bunkhouses. A rifle butt slammed against the floorboards directly above Ahanu's head. Once. Twice. Dust and splinters rained down, getting in his eyes and mouth. He held his breath, forcing himself not to cough, not to move. Beside him, Sarah's hand found his in the darkness, gripping hard enough to hurt. The pounding stopped. Silence for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then Pike's voice moving away. Nothing. Let's check the perimeter. They can't have gone far. The boots moved to the door. It slammed. Voices faded outside. They waited in the dark for another 15 minutes by Ahanu's count, listening to the men search the area around the bunkhouse, calling to each other. Then the voices grew more distant. Hooves clattered on stone, the men riding up toward the mine entrance to search there. Ahanu pushed the floorboard aside and climbed out, then helped Sarah up. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair coming loose from its pins, but her eyes were clear and focused. They slipped out through a window on the opposite side of the bunkhouse from where the horses had been tied, dropping into the shadow of a tailings pile. Ahanu's roan stood where they had left it, ground-tied and patient. They mounted and rode away from Eagle Pass at a careful walk, not risking noise, heading not back toward Lone Pine, but north toward the railroad line. If they could reach it before Pike found them, they could follow it to the next depot and catch a train to Cheyenne, carrying the ledgers straight to the authorities. Behind them, a shout rose as someone discovered they were gone. Then hoofbeats coming fast. Ahanu kicked the horse into a gallop, leaning low over its neck, Sarah pressed against his back. They raced through the darkness, the horse's hooves pounding on stone and earth, the sound enormous. They had a lead, but not much of one. And 300 rifles hidden in a bunkhouse was evidence that men would kill to protect. They rode through the night without stopping, pushing the horse as hard as they dared on the treacherous terrain. By dawn, they had reached the railroad line, where it cut through a narrow valley, the steel rails gleaming dully in the early light. A freight train sat on a siding, its engine cold, the crew nowhere visible. They must have stopped to let a passenger train pass and were taking the opportunity to rest. Ahanu and Sarah hid in a copse of cottonwoods near the tracks, the horse tied deep in the trees where it would not be easily spotted. They ate dried venison and drank water from a creek, not speaking much, both too exhausted for conversation. Sarah cleaned the worst of the dirt from her face with water, and a corner of her shirt wincing as she worked around scrapes and bruises. Ahanu watched her in the growing light and saw clearly for the first time the toll the past 2 days had taken, the dark circles under her eyes, the pallor of her skin, and the way her hands shook slightly when she thought he was not looking. "You should rest," he said quietly. "So should you. I've done this before. You haven't." She met his eyes with a look that was equal parts exhaustion and stubbornness. "I worked 36-hour shifts at the telegraph office when traffic was heavy. I slept in a chair at my desk and dreamed in Morse code. I can manage." Despite everything, he almost smiled. "I believe you." They rested for an hour in turns, one keeping watch, while the other dozed, never both sleeping at the same time. As the sun climbed higher, The freight train's crew emerged from wherever they had been resting and began preparing to move. "We need to get on that train," Sarah said. "If we can reach Cheyenne." "I know, but we have to go to Red Bluff first." She frowned. "Why, that's the wrong direction." "Because my uncle's name is in those ledgers. Because he either approved those shipments knowing what they were, or someone forged his signature. Either way, I need to know which before we go to the authorities. If he's guilty, he needs to face that. If he's innocent, he might be the witness we need to make the case against Pike." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "That's personal and dangerous. Pike knows you have family in Red Bluff." "I know. He'll expect you to go there." "Probably. But you're going anyway." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then we go together. But if it's a trap we run, we don't die for pride or family loyalty." "Agreed." They waited until the freight train began to move, then ran alongside as it gathered speed. Sarah jumped first, catching the ladder on a boxcar and hauling herself up with the upper body strength of someone who had done physical labor, despite her years at a desk. Ahanu followed, his boots slipping once on the wet metal before he found purchase. They climbed to the roof and lay flat, the wind tearing at their clothes and hair as the train picked up speed. Below them, the valley blurred past. Ahead, the mountains rose white and sharp against the blue sky. Red Bluff was 8 hours away by train. They had 8 hours to rest, to plan, and to prepare for whatever waited there. Red Bluff was smaller than Lone Pine, barely more than a depot, and a handful of buildings clustered around the railroad tracks like chicks around a hen. The freight office was a narrow structure with peeling paint separated from the depot itself. They jumped from the train as it slowed for the Red Bluff stop, landing in tall grass beyond the platform and circling wide to avoid being seen by passengers or crew. Ahanu led the way to a stand of trees where they could watch the freight office. Lamplight showed in the back window, though it was mid-afternoon. Someone was inside. "I'll go in alone first," Ahanu said. "Less threatening that way. You wait here, watch the street. If Pike shows up, fire one shot to warn me, then run for the depot and get on any train heading anywhere." "No. If it's a trap, 2 people have better odds than 1. He wanted to argue, but recognized the futility. Sarah had already proven she would not be left behind in safety while others took risks. "Then stay behind me. And if shooting starts, aim at the floor first. Might be we can talk our way out before it comes to killing." They approached the freight office from the rear, moving through the alley between buildings. The back door was unlocked. Ahanu pushed it open slowly, wincing at the faint creak of hinges. Inside, Fritz Kruger sat at a desk covered with paperwork, his head in his hands. He was 55, broad-shouldered from years of physical labor, with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades in the sun and wind. He looked exhausted. At the sound of the door, Fritz's head snapped up, and his face went through a rapid series of changes: shock, fear, guilt, relief, before settling into something like resignation. "Ahanu," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been tears or shouting or both. "What are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you about some ledgers. About Springfield rifles being shipped through this office to Eagle Pass Mine." Fritz's face went pale as old paper. "How did you?" "We found the rifles. Found the ledgers. Your name is on the approval documents." Ahanu kept his voice flat and hard, not allowing room for emotion yet. "Tell me you didn't know what you were approving." Fritz stood slowly, his hands raised to show they were empty. "I knew." The words hit like a fist. Ahanu had hoped, despite everything, that there would be an explanation that did not involve betrayal. "Why?" The word came out harsher than intended. "Because Pike said if I didn't cooperate, he'd have you arrested. He'd fabricate charges, plant evidence, get you hanged just like your brother. Fritz's voice broke. He said your being half Lakota made it easy, that all he had to do was claim you threatened someone or stole something, and no jury would think twice. And I couldn't. He stopped, pressing his hands to his face. I couldn't let that happen. You're all I have left of Annalise. All I have left of my sister. The name of Ahanu's mother hung in the air between them. Sarah stepped forward. What about Henry Calhoun? Fritz flinched as if she had struck him. Calhoun was a railroad clerk. Honest man. He found a copy of one of the shipping ledgers in a freight car, must have fallen out during loading. He started asking questions, going through archived manifests. He figured out the pattern: legitimate freight mixed with illegal shipments, all using approved channels and forged signatures. Fritz looked at Ahanu. He knew about you. Said you were the only scout he'd met who seemed genuinely honest. He was planning to contact you, ask for your help bringing it to the authorities. But before he could, Pike sent Greaves. You saw it happen? Sarah's voice was sharp. No, but I heard them afterward. Pike and Greaves standing in this office laughing about it. Pike said Calhoun had been too curious for his own good. Greaves said it was the easiest money he ever made. Just walked into Calhoun's office after hours, shot him, once took the ledger, left. Made it look like a robbery. Fritz's hands shook. I should have gone to the law then. Should have found a way to get the truth out. But I was afraid. Afraid for you, afraid for myself. Ahanu felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical burden. His uncle, who had helped raise him, who had taught him to read German and work with his hands, had been part of a smuggling operation that had gotten a good man killed. Had approved shipments of stolen weapons that could have been used to kill settlers or soldiers or Lakota people caught in the middle. You're coming with us, Ahanu said flatly. You're going to testify to all of this. You're going to tell the railroad investigators and the federal marshals exactly what happened. Fritz shook his head slowly. If I testify, Pike will kill me before I ever reach a courthouse. Then we'll make sure you're protected. There is no protection. Pike has connections all through the territory. Men who owe him favors, men he pays, men who are afraid of him. Then you'll die a coward who let a good man's murder go unpunished. The words were brutal, and Ahanu meant them to be. Fritz flinched as if Ahanu had hit him. The back door burst open. Deputy Pike stepped inside, a revolver in his hand, Clancy Greaves right behind him. Touching family reunion. Pike said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. But it ends here. Time seemed to slow. Ahanu's hand moved toward his knife. Sarah's hand moved toward the derringer at her belt. Pike's revolver swung toward Fritz. The shot was enormous in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash bright as lightning. Fritz staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his shirt in a dark stain. He crashed into the desk and slid to the floor. Sarah screamed. Ahanu lunged forward, but Greaves was faster, slamming the butt of his rifle into Ahanu's stomach. Ahanu doubled over, gasping for air, his vision graying at the edges. Pike walked to Fritz and looked down at him without expression. Should have kept your mouth shut, old man. Should have burned the ledgers when I told you to. Fritz looked up at him, his face gray with shock and pain. Go to hell, Pike. After you? Pike raised the revolver. No. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. She had the derringer out, both hands wrapped around it, aiming at Pike's center mass. Pike turned slowly, his own revolver now pointing at her. You going to shoot me, ma'am? That little thing won't kill me fast enough to stop me from putting one in your skull. Maybe not. Sarah said, her voice shaking but her hands steady. but it'll hurt enough that you won't enjoy it. And that's satisfaction enough." They stood frozen, a standoff, Pike and Sarah both armed, both aimed, both waiting for the other to break. Greaves moved toward Sarah from the side, trying to flank her. Ahanu, still on his knees and gasping, grabbed a heavy ledger from the floor and hurled it at Greaves. It hit him in the face with enough force to break his nose, blood spraying. Greaves cursed and stumbled. The door burst open again. Doc Whitcomb stood there with his hunting rifle, Mrs. Eliza Hart behind him with a shotgun that looked enormous in her hands. "Pike," Doc Whitcomb said, his voice calm and cold. "You're going to put that gun down, and then you're going to step outside. And then we're all going to have a conversation with the railroad investigator I wired from Lone Pine, who should be arriving on the evening train in about 20 minutes. Pike's face went through several expressions, shock, rage, calculation. Then he smiled cold and mean. "You think one investigator is going to change anything? I've got friends." "Had friends," Mrs. Hart said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Past tense. "We sent telegrams to 6 different offices. Railroad investigators, federal marshals, territorial governor, all with copies of the ledgers Ahanu found. By now, half the territory knows what you've been doing. Your friends are going to be too busy covering their own backsides to protect you." The calculation in Pike's eyes shifted. He looked at the 2 weapons pointed at him, at Fritz bleeding on the floor, at Ahanu getting slowly to his feet. "This isn't over," Pike said. "Yes," Ahanu said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "It is." Pike holstered his revolver slowly and raised his hands. "Fine, we'll do this legal. But you're making a mistake too, Feathers. I'll walk free, and when I do, you'll regret it." "Maybe," Ahanu said. "But not today." Doc Whitcomb kept his rifle trained on Pike, while Mrs. Hart moved to Fritz, kneeling beside him and examining the wound with practiced efficiency. "It's bad," she said quietly. "But if we can get him to a doctor—" "I'm a doctor," Whitcomb said. "We'll take him to my office in Lone Pine. But we need to move him carefully." The railroad investigator arrived exactly when expected, a thin man in a gray suit with sharp eyes and the kind of face that suggested he did not believe anything until he had verified it personally. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he carried a badge from the Territorial Railroad Commission. Ahanu handed over both ledgers, the fragment Sarah had saved from the fire and the full ledger from Eagle Pass Mine. Thorne read through them with increasing grimness, occasionally asking questions that Ahanu or Sarah answered. Fritz gave a full statement from the floor where Doc Whitcomb was bandaging his shoulder, his voice weak but clear. He described Pike's threats, the coercion, the smuggling operation. He described hearing Pike and Greaves talk about Calhoun's murder. Mrs. Hart testified about the attack on the schoolhouse and the attempt to destroy evidence. Doc Whitcomb testified about treating Sarah's gunshot wound and about Pike's general reputation for corruption. By the time the evening train left, Red Bluff, Pike and Greaves were in custody, their hands chained, facing charges of theft of government property, conspiracy, smuggling, and murder. Fritz was on the train too, under guard, but on his way to proper medical care and eventual trial for his role in the smuggling. Ahanu and Sarah rode back to Lone Pine with Doc Whitcomb and Mrs. Hart, all of them silent with exhaustion. But there was a sense, fragile and new, that maybe justice was possible after all. The trial took place in Cheyenne 6 weeks later. Pike and Greaves were convicted on all charges. Pike received 20 years in federal prison. Greaves received 25, with an additional 5 for Calhoun's murder after a jury deliberated for less than an hour. Nathan Hale, the reservation trader, fled the territory before he could be arrested. A federal warrant was issued, but he was never found. Some said he went to Canada. Others said Mexico. A few whispered that he had tried to cross Lakota land and been dealt with according to their justice, which left no body and no witnesses. Fritz Kruger pleaded guilty to conspiracy, and received a sentence of 5 years reduced to 3 for his cooperation and testimony. He served his time in the territorial prison and emerged a quieter, older man. He moved to Lone Pine after his release, took a job at the sawmill, and lived in a small cabin not far from Ahanu's. They spoke occasionally careful conversations that were more about practical matters than the past. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was something like understanding. Old Tom Rooker, whose name had been in the original ledger fragment, was investigated and cleared of any involvement. It turned out Pike had used Tom's name without permission, routing one shipment through his property, while Tom was visiting family in the East. Tom was furious when he found out and became one of the loudest voices demanding Pike's conviction. The townspeople of Lone Pine held a collection to rebuild the schoolhouse, raising enough money in 2 weeks to construct a new building with proper windows and a sound roof. Mrs. Hart hired Sarah Bell as an assistant teacher and telegraph operator, teaching children Morse code and basic communication skills alongside reading and arithmetic. Doc Whitcomb's son Charlie recovered from his lung fever with the help of proper medicine purchased from the reward money the railroad paid to Ahanu and Sarah for exposing the smuggling ring. Charlie returned to school quieter than before, but healthy, and within a year, he was teaching the younger children their letters. The railroad sent a formal letter of apology to Ahanu, along with a commendation for his role in exposing the corruption. The letter also included a correction to all official records, noting that he had never been involved in any illegal activity, and had in fact acted with integrity throughout. Ahanu burned the commendation, but kept the correction in his mother's hymnal, where her name was written in her own hand. One cool evening in early fall, as the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter, Ahanu and Sarah walked along the fence road, where they had first encountered each other in the rain and mud, what felt like a lifetime ago. They walked in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing, watching the sun set over the Whitehorn Range and paint the snow pink and orange. Mrs. Hart offered me a permanent position, Sarah said finally. Full salary room in the boarding house included. She wants to expand the telegraph service, maybe set up a network connecting some of the smaller settlements. Ahanu nodded his eyes on the horizon. That's good work. It is. I told her yes. He glanced at her. You're staying permanently. If the town will have me. She paused, then added more quietly, if you want me to. He stopped walking and turned to face her. In the fading light, her face was shadowed and beautiful. The angles softened, but the strength still visible in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze. I want you to stay. He said the words coming easier than he expected. I want... He stopped searching for the right words in a language that had never felt adequate for expressing things that mattered. I spent 15 years keeping everyone at a distance, not letting anyone close enough to hurt me or to be used against me. It was safe, but it was lonely. And then you showed up in a rainstorm, and everything I'd built started to crack apart. Is that a bad thing? She asked softly. No, he said. It's terrifying, but it's not bad. She smiled small and real. I've been running for 3 years from a telegraph message I barely understood, afraid of shadows and possibilities. I was so tired of being afraid. And then I met you, and you were exactly what I'd feared, a name connected to violence and death, except you weren't. You were just a person trying to survive and be decent in a world that makes both those things hard. She took a breath. I don't want to run anymore, Ahanu. I want to stay here. I want to build something real. With me? If you'll have me. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand. Her fingers closed around his, warm and strong and certain. Yes, he said. I'll have you. They stood there as the sun finished setting. Hands joined both of them, aware that this was a choice that would change everything, and that change was no longer something to fear. A month later, on a cold, bright morning with fresh snow on the peaks, Ahanu asked Sarah to marry him. He did it at his cabin, which he had spent 3 weeks expanding and improving, adding a second room with a door that could be closed for privacy and propriety, replacing the leaking sod roof with proper shingles, building furniture from pine he had cut and planed himself. Sarah said yes before he finished asking, which made him laugh, a sound he had not made in longer than he could remember. They were married in the schoolhouse, with half the town in attendant settler families, and Lakota families, both people who had learned through the trial and its aftermath that maybe the lines they had drawn between themselves were not as necessary or as permanent as they had believed. Doc Whitcomb stood as witness, Charlie beside him, grinning. Fritz attended, standing in the back, his face still showing the effects of his imprisonment, but his eyes clear. Mrs. Hart officiated, reading from a Lutheran hymnal that had belonged to Ahanu's mother, and speaking of trust and partnership and the hard work of building a life together. Afterward, Charlie rang the school bell, and the sound carried across the valley, bright and clear and celebratory. One afternoon in late spring, when the wildflowers covered the hills and the Sable River ran clear and fast with snowmelt, a courier arrived at the schoolhouse with an envelope bearing official seals and postmarks from Cheyenne. Sarah opened it at her desk, Ahanu standing beside her. Inside was a notarized packet from the railroad auditor's office, accompanied by a letter explaining that during a routine archive review following Pike's conviction, a previously misfiled telegram had been discovered in the records from June 1883. The telegram was clear and complete. To Territory, Marshal Service, Cheyenne, from H. Calhoun Railroad Clerk, Cheyenne Depot. Date, June 10, 1883. Urgent rifles stolen from Army Depot have proof. Ledger shows systematic theft and resale. Deputy E. Pike and hired gun C. Greaves responsible. Freight agent K. coerced under threat. Do not trust local law. A. Two Feathers is no conspirator. He is the only scout I have met who I would trust with my life. If this message reaches you after my death, find him. He will help you finish this send. Help H.C. Sarah read it twice, her hands trembling slightly. Then she handed it to Ahanu. He stared at the words, reading them over and over. Calhoun had trusted him, had written his name as the one honest man in the territory, had believed in him enough to stake his life on it. And Calhoun had died 3 years ago before he could send the message that might have changed everything. He tried, Sarah said quietly. He tried to protect you and expose Pike at the same time. I wish I'd known him. Ahanu said, his voice rough. I wish I could thank him. You did thank him. You finished what he started. You made sure his death meant something. Ahanu folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his pocket. For 15 years, he had believed that white testimony only destroyed, that white words were weapons used against people who looked like him. His brother had died because a white girl's words were believed over his brother's silence. But here was a white man's testimony that could have saved him, that had been intended to save him. That proved not all words were weapons, not all people were enemies. It did not erase his brother's death, did not make the 15 years of caution and distance and loneliness less real. But it complicated the story he had told himself about how the world worked and who could be trusted. That evening, Ahanu and Sarah rode to the small cemetery on the hill above Lone Pine, where old Tom Rooker lay buried with a simple wooden marker. Beside Tom's grave was another marker, older and weathered, that Ahanu had placed there himself 15 years ago when they finally let him bury his brother. Ahanu knelt and placed the telegram on his brother's grave, the paper weighted down with a smooth river stone. This is for you, he said quietly. Proof that at least one person tried to tell the truth when it mattered. I wish it had come in time to save you. But maybe it's enough that it came at all." Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The wind swept across the hill, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Below them, the Sable River flowed steadily, its sound a constant presence. Beyond the river, the town of Lone Pine spread out in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys, children playing in the street, the school bell ringing to mark the end of the day. From the schoolhouse, faint and rhythmic, came the sound of someone tapping out Morse code. Charlie practicing his lessons, the dots and dashes carrying across the distance. Ahanu stood and took Sarah's hand. They walked back down the hill together, toward the town and the school and the life they were building with deliberate care and earned trust. The sun set behind the Whitehorn Range, painting the snow gold, and the sky 1,000 shades of purple and orange. The wind carried the promise of summer of warm days and thunderstorms of work and harvest of time, stretching forward instead of being trapped in the past. They had survived. They had fought for justice and won something that looked like it, imperfect but real. They had chosen each other with full knowledge of the risks and the costs. It was not the end of difficulty. There would still be prejudice and suspicion, still be people who thought a half Lakota man and a widow from Omaha did not belong together or belong anywhere. There would still be hard winters and failed crops and the 1,000 ordinary cruelties of life in Montana Territory in 1886. But they would face it together with allies beside them and a foundation built on something stronger than fear. That was enough. That was everything.